So welcome everyone. Time is 6:02. We're going to call the regular scheduled council meeting to order. Today is that the land on which we gather is the traditional territories of the Coast and Straits Salish peoples. Specifically, we recognize the Lekwungen people, known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. Their connections to this land and these waters continue to this day. Item number 2 on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Can I have a motion to approve the agenda? Moved and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. We have adoption of the minutes of March 27th, both 5:15 and 6 p.m. Can I get a motion to adopt the minutes? Moved and seconded. Are there any corrections or changes or amendments to any of those minutes? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. There was a suggestion, Ms. Williams, that it might benefit from some clarity on the minutes of September 27th. We've asked, given directions to conduct a district-wide review of optimization, and as we have a session coming up here looking at some of the community building funds, that it might be helpful to clarify that ask as a motion arising. Is that something that you would like us to contemplate at this time, or are we sufficient with the broad nature of this, of what's in the minutes right now?
Thank you, Your Worship. I think if staff could get some clarification from council along the lines of prioritizing specific business areas for optimization, that would be helpful for our next step in the process. So as you noted, the resolution in the March 27th minutes addresses optimizing the provision of services to achieve cost-effective structure district-wide. So an options analysis to come back on a district-wide optimization. Recently, since this resolution was adopted, the Growing Community Funds was announced, and it was identified as a potential funding source for an optimization in the community building and planning area specifically, and staff is considering bringing that forward as one of the options for your consideration on May the 8th. So the motion arising that staff is recommending seeks to recognize that funding opportunity and move away from a district-wide review, so a broad scope, to a more incremental approach. So it doesn't take anything off the table. What it does is it would give council direction to move, give staff direction to move ahead with the community building and planning optimization initially, and then proceed to the identification of any mitigation strategies required for Parks, Rec and Culture in Q3, which was kind of the trigger for this resolution, if council recalls. And then the balance of the organization would be considered as a third step in that process. So it really just provides a companion resolution that prioritizes the sequencing of that optimization.
Thank you. And just for my clarification, if the wording that's put up here goes forward, it essentially brings it will essentially result in a staff bringing a suggested project forward to that consideration of the Growing Communities Fund. Is that how that works?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes.
And that would be the decision point for whether or not to move forward with it. This is not the decision point. I'm just trying to make sure I'm clear about what we're asking for here.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, the decision point will be on May the 8th or at a future date, depending on where council lands on May the 8th. The request tonight is really just to break this broad scope review up into incremental steps so that staff can report on options for each area separately instead of a broad district-wide review.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll just turn to my counterparts here at the table. If anybody wishes to make these motions, I'm happy to take them. If not, then go ahead, Councillor Smart.
Yeah, I would like to put forward the motion arising. Would you like it read out, Selena?
I would appreciate that, just because we have a councillor, and I should just, I was going to say it in my minute, in my mayor's comments, but we do have one of our councillors is traveling, Councillor Braithwaite. And as a result, she's coming in by phone, so we're going to take a little bit of extra effort to make sure that we're reading aloud any motions that are different from what's in the agenda package. So go ahead, Councillor Smart.
I'd like to make the motion arising that in relation to Council Resolution 2023-174, Council directs staff to prioritize consideration of the optimization of the Community Building and Planning Department, subject to staff presenting a project for funding consideration under the Growing Communities Fund, and request interim options to reduce tax impacts on PRC during Q3 budget forecast should revenues continue as budgeted.
Moved and seconded. Okay, thank you. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Smart?
I would just like to address the fact that I think it would be great just to have all options for council to consider when this comes back to the table as far as how we can utilize that fund. So I don't see any negative in having more options to consider at that time.
All right, thank you. Any other discussion on the motion? Go ahead, Councillor Appleton and Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll speak against the motion on the floor. I see the intent here, and I see the value of having, considering the service optimization as part of that. The council has not had. I'm not comfortable moving forward with this at this stage of the game until council's had any kind of discussion about the Growing Communities Fund. It's been announced. It's never come before council. Council hasn't even sort of had a broad-ranging discussion about the broad categories that they may be interested in applying those funds towards, the timing of those things, what the strategic application of that fund may be in the Oakway context. So at this stage of the game, not willing to get behind a motion that specifically references the Growing Communities Fund. I understand what the intent of the motion is intended to do, but it's a little bit cart before the horse, in my opinion, at this stage of the game, considering we haven't discussed the Growing Communities Fund around the council table at all at this juncture. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Go ahead, Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Mayor. My hesitation in supporting this motion is that I thought that the underlying resolution was specifically related to Parks, Rec and Culture, because the service review that was considered was a discussion about setting fees for service levels at PRC. And suddenly it seems to be broader than that. So I'm uncomfortable with the underlying basis on which this would be added on top. But I am happy to be corrected if I totally misunderstood what I had voted for on March 27th. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. I don't know, Ms. Williams, if you want to address it at the end of the day. The motion is as it was written, and we have to vote on that. Do you want to address that original motion? Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. And Councillor Watson's recollection is accurate that the conversation did start during the financial planning meeting when we were discussing Parks, Rec and Culture and potential tax implications for 2024 should revenues continue as budgeted, which is less than what had historically been achieved. Through that discussion, Council was asked to consider more broadly the entire organization and where maybe cost savings could be found more globally instead of focusing on one department. And so the resulting resolution was a district-wide service review, so not focusing on one particular area. And I appreciate the irony in that staff is asking you now to go back and identify singularly the priority sequence to bring those forward. But the motion arising doesn't add anything to the motion. It just breaks it into 3 bite-sized pieces.
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Don't see other hands popping up on this one. Oh, go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, Mayor, thank you. And speaking against the motion, I realize the way that this first came forward, but I think, and certainly respecting what our CAO has just given by way of clarification on this and the intent, but I still think that starts to silo it. And if you're going to do a service review, I don't think that it should be focused simply on cost-effective structure as really value proposition for the community. So I look at it being broader in that aspect. And also I think that council should then have discussion about where exactly we should start and what what outcomes we would expect of the service level review. So I think this as an inference that we are looking at a much broader review of all of our departments, and we will start in a certain place. And if we're going to have those discussions, then that's what I would look forward to discussing as a council. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. I'm going to speak for the first time, and I'll go back to you, Councillor Watson. So, in seeing this piece come risen, I struggle with it because I sort of felt that staff had the freedom to bring forward options within that to the May 8th meeting, where we're going to look at the Growing Communities Fund and all of the pieces that are part of it. I still feel that way. I don't think it's actually required. I think of all of the things that are being brought forward as things that we could look at, I think that is. That being said, the motion that's in front of us, to my mind, just allows this to be one of those things a bit more clearly. And I totally understand what Councillor Appleton, what you've said, and I agree that I don't want to be presupposing that this would make the list. I just do think that, as it seems to qualify, it may be one of those ones that we can allocate at that meeting if it makes sense. And so I am supportive of the motion. I didn't necessarily feel it was necessary, but I think given that it's been made, that I would encourage us to support it, just so that we have that option come forward to us. I would certainly be very curious to see what that is. The Building and Planning Department, we know, has got an enormous amount of pressure between the announcements by the province, between the secondary suites piece, all those sort of things. If there's ways, and the language here I appreciate, which is optimize, I think is fantastic. I think there's lots of work that we could do, and if there's some funding external that we could use for that to jumpstart it, I think that would make sense. I don't know if it makes sense in the context of all the other pressures and asks that we're going to have, and that would come back to us on May 8th. So, I'm supportive of the motion as it stands, just because I do want to have that conversation on the day of. And I'm going to go to first-time speaker still, so Councillor Green and then Councillor Watson.
Thank you. My initial reaction was that it should be a separate meeting, and I think I expressed my thoughts earlier in the day to Ms. Williams, but I think the dialogue around the table and Ms. Williams' explanation and clarity have provided enough explanation for me to support the motion, so I will support the motion. Thank you.
Watson?
Thank you, Mayor, and through you to Ms. Williams, just to help me in my thinking about how to proceed. Now that I understand that the first part, the underlying resolution, I understand now more clearly, because I was clearly off the mark there. But what are the elements of the GCF that speaks to the community building and planning project optimization as being a need or a pressing need? Like, what are the things that stand out in what you know so far that would make you want to bring this forward in this, that would encourage council to want to do this now, as opposed to following the process we'd anticipated?
Ms. Williams, I think I might rephrase that, because it's really what qualifies for the Growing Community Fund as opposed to what should be prioritized. That's going to be our call. But go ahead, Ms. Williams.
Thank you, Your Worship. I do believe Ms. Morton is online, and if so, she would be the best qualified to answer that question.
Well, why don't we go to Ms. Morton online, our Deputy Director of Strategic Initiatives and knower of all things grants. Welcome, Ms. Morton.
Thank you, Your Worship. Everyone can hear me?
We can, thank you.
Okay, great. Excuse me, thank you. So what I can confirm, there is, sorry if you can hear my dog in the background here, I'm just going to switch rooms. There is broad eligibility within several different categories of infrastructure projects for the Growing Communities Fund. There's also a capacity building piece that relates specifically to initiatives that support housing. And so what we do know about that is the overarching goal of the Growing Communities Fund is to advance housing in British Columbia. So any project that we'd be proposing, whether capital or capacity building, would need to have that connection.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Morton. I'm just going to give the opportunity for Councillor Braithwaite, who is remote, to have the opportunity of speaking, just because it's awkward when you're not in the room.
Actually, I'm fine with moving ahead with this motion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other discussion on the motion as it stands right now? Okay, I'll call the question then. All those in favor? And those opposed? I have Councillor Appleton and Patterson opposed. Since you indicated you were supportive, Councillor Braithwaite, I will, please speak up now if you're in opposition, otherwise we will move on. So that carries with those two opposed. Look forward to that coming in our package and considering it amongst all the other things that happen on May 8th. That's going to be a big meeting. We have two Rise and reports under section 4. We can move them both simultaneously if people are, go ahead, moved and seconded. Thank you. Any, discuss what we can. Any discussions on the Rise and reports? Not seeing any. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. Mayor's remarks. Mine are a little bit longer than they usually are, but I just will preface this. If anybody is watching the live stream, particularly on YouTube, there's often a minute or so delay. So if you wish to address council in the public participation period, which is next, you can do so. That is the period where you can talk to us about any issues related to Oak Bay. Not items on the agenda. Both of the later items on the agenda do have public participation opportunities, but just items of general interest. You would call into the 1855 number and hit *9 to raise your, or hit the reactions tab or hit *9 to raise your hand, and we will take your call at that time. So with that, as I noted already, Councillor Braithwaite is off traveling and will be for a while, so is joining us remotely. And so we look forward to that. The technology seems to work fairly well, so that's good news. And welcome, Councillor Braithwaite, and thank you for participating even on your holidays. I want to remind or let people know that there is Camas Day coming up on April 30th. This is always a popular community event held at Cattle Point, or at the entrance to Cattle Point in Uplands Park. There's a large number of community organizations that come there and talk about restoration and stewardship and all things nature. So look forward to seeing it. There's live music and all kinds of fun stuff. It's a great family event. And for some strange reason, usually has nice weather that day. So hopefully we'll keep that tradition going as well. I want to just share that there was in fact, it was on the front of the paper today, but today was the official announcement day of the BC Transit's rapid bus. So phase 1 now live as of yesterday. And so that's running from the West Shore downtown. There's still some enhancements coming, but really quite a significant improvement. Basically, all trips during the sort of 7 a.m. till 10 p.m. time frame are in that sort of range, or 7 p.m. depending on the day of the week, are happening every 7 minutes or so. So it's a really very fast and using a lot of the dedicated bus lanes that have been built along the highway. So knocking at about 20 minutes off of the previous time, which was had already been reduced by about 30 minutes just with the addition of the bus lanes and so forth. So it's now, I think, the fastest way you can get in from the West Shore into the downtown core, and really a significant. So because our very capable Regional Transit Commission chair was unable to attend the announcement today, I had the honor of going down and representing the Transit Commission board at that announcement with Minister Fleming and the City of Victoria. Just a heads up on a couple of things coming on the CRD agenda later this week or tomorrow, since it's Tuesday today. There's one, we're having some discussion about potential changes to the land banking and housing service. Depending on what happens, or they'll come back. Because it's a service establishment that would come back here for consideration. But looking at changing the way that we've done land acquisition or housing acquisition through that fund, the way we've used it to date is essentially bought land by acquiring money into it over time, and looking instead of maybe filling that fund and using that as a borrowing service. So we would actually acquire land on a borrowing basis instead of acquiring the funds and then buying model. That has not been established, but that's the discussion that's happening. And that's the first chance that we're also having, the CRD's having to look at its growing community fund, which has got a lot more complexity than we do here. I will say that because the electoral areas and so forth have a very different funding formula that causes some complexity in that space. But So that'll be my first chance to sort of do a deep dive at it, but certainly from a regional perspective, the CRD's Growing Communities Fund is intended to benefit the region as a whole, so we'll probably see some additional benefits here from that as well. I wanted to just give I've had a couple of questions lately about Oak Bay Lodge, so I thought I'd give a quick update. There's no hospital district meeting this month, so this is the chance to do it, is here. So just a few points. Obviously, it's the demolition is complete, and the work is ongoing in terms of the future. There was, of course, a public participation, public engagement process that provided some feedback, and that's guiding the framework that, at a very high level, was sort of suggested from the community and the region that seniors care and general community care services would be the priority. The board some time ago gave direction to staff to look for some innovative uses of that land to help meet the healthcare goals. Island Health obviously is the key service provider for healthcare in the region, and so where it's sitting right now is that the Capital Regional Hospital District staff are working with Island Health staff to quantify what their needs are in the short and medium term for the number and type of services that they could move onto that site. That's work ongoing, not yet complete, so that's kind of holding things up a little bit, and because that ultimately will determine the core lease for the site and determine what other services might be added into that to those core pieces. So that work is undergoing. The staff are also under the innovative and creative uses, have been actively reaching out to a number of other service providers to look at perhaps some sort of more cohesive seniors care model for the site that would incorporate the Island Health portions, but also some other third-party pieces, including, I'm hoping, some primary care services as well. So there's really nothing happening in the public realm, but a lot of work happening behind the scenes with staff right now, and certainly very appreciative of the work that people are doing on it. But it's yes, it's certainly something I think the whole community is interested in seeing move forward. And I thought I'd just touch base really quickly on the David Eby announcement last week about housing. Obviously, the province has indicated some pretty significant changes to allow zoning across BC. Eliminating single-family zoning are some of the words used. I just want to, for the people who are watching this, the housing forms that they contemplate, those are duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, along with townhomes and other infill housing forms. We're not sure what that would look like from the province, but they are already being contemplated by Oak Bay. We're obviously under 2/3 of the way through our infill housing piece, and so. I guess what I just wanted to say in this format was that announcement is still not clear on how that will be implemented from the province, but staff are working with the ministry and trying to understand how that may or may not impact our work underway. The work we've done to this point has been with consultation with the community and looking at it from a bit more nuance than we seems the province is doing, but we'll see what they're willing to work with. But I thought I'd just share here today because I think we're all kind of curious about timelines and things. So in talking with staff, we do expect to see an initial staff report related to the infill housing project on May 8th as we're looking at some of those pieces. So we're not what we're going to do, but that'll be probably the first chance we have as a council with some staff. Hopefully we'll have some, the province will have had a chance to sort of tease out some of their approaches and what that would look like. We don't know exactly how much information we'll have, but that should give us some chance to contemplate whether that project should be advanced in its current form, modified in some way, or perhaps reprioritized amongst other pieces. But we don't know what that is at this point. So it feels frustrating to me at this point that we don't know. But I think we have to get some feedback from staff and understanding of what the province is doing before we can make any kind of direction or things on that. So that is my update. I don't usually take questions, but there's a lot more meat to that one than there usually is. Is there any questions anybody wants answered at this point on that? Yeah, Councillor Green.
Thank you. Just quickly, because I've served on both of them, but so you were talking about the RHTF and the Housing Corporation Board. Those two bodies at the CRD are?
No, sorry, the Capital Regional Hospitals District.
Oh, hospital.
Not
okay.
housing.
Sorry, thanks.
Yeah, and the land banking and housing while it's been used by the Housing Corporation, is actually a Capital Regional District service. Always ask for clarification. Thank you for that. So with that, we move on to the public comment and question period. This is a chance for members of the public to ask any questions of council that they see fit. I don't see anybody from the public who's indicated they wish to speak, despite my earlier call for people to call in. So I'm going to give it just a few seconds here to make sure that there's no late arrivals. I will say, if there's some technical issue you're having and you want to come in and you raise your hand, we will always do our best to come back and give that opportunity here. I don't see anybody. There was nobody registered to speak today, so I'm going to move on then into the section 7 of the agenda. This is our reports and memorandums section. We have 2 different reports. Both are subject to public input. So again, if you're a member of the public who wishes to address us on item 7.1, which is a liquor license referral application, you should call into the 1855 number at this time and hit *9. That is *9, not #9, to raise your hand and indicate you wish to speak, or come into the Zoom, which is a slightly more efficient system, and raise your hand. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Mr. Bowl. Mr. Bowl is our Director of Community Building and Planning. Welcome to the meeting, Mr. Bowl.
Thank you, Your Worship. To provide a short introduction before I hand it over to Mr. Green. So a liquor license referral for you. You've seen a couple, council has seen a couple of those over the last 8 months. In this case, we added in some more information about how we review them and what our processes are, or rather the lack of processes that we have in this case. Because we thought it would be worthwhile to raise the question with council if there was an interest to either set up a policy or to maybe update our processes to make sure we have a set process for this. So that's some of the context that is also included in the report. We also had some issues with some of the details in the report, and we did make some updates today to the report. So particularly the site plans have been updated. And if need be, I can assist Mr. Green by putting them on the screen through Zoom. But with that, I'll hand it over to Mr. Green to give an introduction of both the application and our suggestions for a policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Bowl, and welcome, Mr. Green. It probably is, when you get to that portion, worthwhile throwing up the differences, just so that we are all looking at the same data when we're contemplating this application. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, Your Worship, members of council. My apologies for some of the errors in the report. It was my first iCompass report, and so learning the ropes with that new software that I've not used before led to a few mistakes along the way. So hopefully I will learn from those mistakes with my next report to you all. As my colleague, Mr. Ball, referenced, this is 2 applications that the district has received from the Liquor License, Liquor and Cannabis Control Branch for the Royal Victoria Yacht Club, who have made those applications to the branch. One is for a permanent change to an expanded outdoor patio, and the second one is for a temporary extension of the licensed area for a open event on April the 29th for a lawned area outside of the yacht club. Obviously, staff have reviewed those applications, referred those applications to internal departments, including the police, and those responses are summarised in the report. But I guess in summary, staff have no objection to the permanent outdoor expansion of that patio area, and have no comments in relation to the temporary extension of the licensed area for that one-off event on April the 29th. In addition, the report is requesting that council also direct staff to draft a liquor licence referral policy regarding opting out of the process for permanent liquor licence referrals, and also delegating to staff the review and comments for temporary changes. And that's essentially in terms of assisting in the streamlining of the process. Essentially also, that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be a public notification process. It would just mean that the district is not undertaking that process but the liquor license, liquor and cannabis control branch would undertake that process outside of the district. On the screen there just shows where the two applications are. So the area outlined in red, which is the existing liquor license, that would be expanded to include include that area, the grassed areas in front of the yacht club for the permanent change. And then the temporary application for the April 29th event is that area shown in green, the lawned area, which will be used for their opening event on April 29th. We did also contact the applicant last week just to tell them that this application will be before council this evening, but I've not heard back from the applicant as to if they've got any further comments to make before council. But happy to answer any questions that council may have on the application, as well as on also the recommendation of drafting a policy on opting out of LCRB referral applications.
Thank you very much, Mr. Green. I have one very quick question on this, on the temporary. April 29th, you said their event was? Is it, I know how long things are taking at the province right now. Is that, if this body recommends approval tonight, is that actually within their time frame to even turn it around for the province? I guess we do what we do. Go ahead, Mr. Bull.
Thank you, Mayor. The LCB has been in touch with us, so they're aware of for us running through this process. So I didn't get the impression that was going to be an issue for them. So I think in this case, because it has been in the works for a while, LCRB is basically waiting for us to get back to them on this.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions of staff on this? Proceed before we get to comments, but I saw a question here from Councillor Watson and then Councillor Green.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Through you to, I guess, Mr. Green or Mr. Bull, whoever. In thinking about having a policy, I think it's a great idea, and we don't want to be duplicating work or processes here. So I'm really open to this idea of just making this entirely an LCRB process. But I do wonder if there are any situations in which you think more local review could add value to the process. Because we don't know what may come in future. We can only think about maybe what's happened in the past, but if you could just comment on that. Thank you.
Through the chair, well, once we've developed that policy, we can obviously we can consult on that policy, so we can consult the police, and which will help to shape that policy, and we'll be able to bring back any comments that they may have on that policy. In addition, if there will still be liquor license applications submitted to LCRB, LCRB would still undertake their own public consultation process. Both the local government, the police, members of the public can still comment on those applications, so they so choose to do if there is some specific local example or local issue that the district or the police or the public wanted to make their comments known on that particular particulars of that application.
So just to clarify, Oak Bay themselves, the district would still be able to comment. We wouldn't have, even in this sort of policy that you seem to be considering, we wouldn't have written ourselves out of an engagement process.
Through the chair, I think we would have written ourselves out of the engagement process, but I don't think it stops the district if we so choose. If we had, if there was something that was contrary to our zoning bylaw, for example, we still wish to make those comments or known to LCRB, I don't think it would restrict us from making those comments. Whether those comments are then taken into account by LCRB, I don't really understand how they make decisions, but you would hope that we would still be able to make representations or comments to an application should it be should that public notification process commence. But generally, elsewhere where previously worked, we would have opted out of the process, and we would always then respond back to the LCRB saying the district has opted out and we have no comments to make on this application.
Great, thank you.
Go ahead, Councillor Green, then Councillor Smart.
I was actually going to make the motion, but I'll leave it for now and let others speak.
Sure, and I just want to go to the public before we call the, so again, members of the public, if anybody wishes to address before we have any motions, we'll do that. Go ahead, Councillor Smart.
Yeah, just one more quick clarifying question. My understanding is with permanent liquor licensing applications that typically there would be a submission by an architect that would be signed and sealed. And I wondered if you could comment on the staff time and process that has happened in the past with reviewing these applications, just to give us a sense of the kind of work that has been done to review them versus the potential of not doing that work.
Go ahead, Mr. Bull.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Through you, we have very little information on that because simply we haven't had these kind of requests for a long time, actually. And when the Penny Farthing pub last year applied for a temporary change, I think that was the first time in a long time that something of this nature was brought forward to council, or that it was referred to us in the first place. Yeah, in itself, I'm familiar with those kind of reviews from other places that I worked. It does require a bit of building permit, building official review, up to a couple of hours. And sure, in the current process, if that's different, if that's up to the applicant to prove to the liquor board, they have their own vetting process as well, particularly if a community opts out, they take care of their own review, including the public consultation, and on that basis they issue or deny the license applications. But that would be in the realm of number of hours that would have been required if we had gotten these before.
Thank you for that clarification. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Mayor. And just speaking to the last recommendation, if staff could clarify what resource time is estimated to be required to develop the criteria for this, it would be useful, and how that would be prioritized in with their other work. Thank you.
I'll go to Mr. Green.
Through the chair, well, I've previously worked at two municipalities that had similar policies, so it would be fairly straightforward to copy the similar policies and bring that policy back to council for review after circulating with internal departments. So I would have thought, yeah, around 10 to 15 hours probably of staff time to bring that policy. I'll put that policy together and then bring that report back to council with that policy attached for council's review and decision.
Thank you. And a follow-up to that, what impact, if any, might this have on council's discussion and decisions around the patios that are being considered, patio expansions?
Mr. Bull.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. It's mostly unrelated, I would say, at first glance, because the patios deal with the arrangements on public property, and they are sometimes, well, most of the patios are for licensed premises, but the patios on the street would operate under existing licenses that the business owner already has for their business. And I think, I'm not sure if they are necessarily included in their liquor license for serving alcohol. That's a bit more of a matter that I'm not entirely sure of, as you can tell by now. So that's something we can look into, but I think that project is focused on creating a program, and the liquor licensing part of that is somewhat out of our purview, because that is regulated through LCRB.
Thank you. I have just a couple of questions. One is, there's a recommendation here or a suggestion of opting out of the permanent liquor license referrals. Is there such a similar opportunity to opt out of the temporary? I would think the temporary are more frequent and less controversial for the most part. Is that an option for us as well? Go ahead, Mr. Bull.
Yeah, the temporary requests, they only require a comment from the local government, so it's a bit of a different approach. So there's no, the LCB does not require a public input process for those from the applicant or from us, for that matter. So it's a different category of, or different level of providing input back to LCRB. And in this case, for the temporary one, expansion for the 1 day, that's simply commenting to the LCRB, and the permanent change to the liquor licensing is a that requires some
opt-out.
kind of resolution or direction from us. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the second half of this, is delegating to staff essentially the review and commenting process. Okay, thank you for that. Is there any ability for us as a district to charge for, so if we were not to opt out, but to keep this thing at our table, is there ability for us to recoup any of the costs of the license application fee? So if there's a permanent liquor license fee being requested, or liquor license change being requested, that we charge for the time that we spend, the 10 or 15 hours, whatever the time is, in some sort of fee structure. Is that allowable under the system? Mr. Bull?
Through you, Mayor, or in response to your question, Mr. Mayor. Yes, we believe we can, because we can charge fees for processes that the district runs. There are other communities that have fees for that as part included in their land use procedures bylaw, so that's what we would look for to make sure that that is covered going forward.
Okay, thank you. And the last question is just, if we were to opt out, I appreciate that they still have a public input, so if we saw that public input process, we would have the opportunity to comment. But would we actually be notified in any formal fashion within that? I'm seeing a shaking of head by Mr. Green, so perhaps you could just answer. So, Councillor.
No, I don't think so. If we opt out, we wouldn't receive any referrals from LCIB. We would, yeah. Although saying that, in the past, where I've worked, even though we've opted out, we'd still receive, in some cases, some applications from LCIB, and we would simply then reply back saying our council has opted out of commenting on LCIB referral applications. See attached policy. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there any other questions of staff before we get to motions? Before I get to the last call here for public input, if anybody wishes to address council on this matter, this is the chance to do so. I'm going to also just give a little pause here in case Councillor Braithwaite wishes has any questions at this point. I'll make sure that she has that opportunity. Is there any other questions from around the table before I get to motions? Okay. So, go ahead, Councillor Green. You indicated you wish to, or I think it was you.
You wanted a motion to receive the report?
Yeah, let's go through them in those orders. So,
Thank
motion
you.
to receive, moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on the receipt? Seeing none, all those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Second motion, perhaps you could just read these, just because, again, I think Councillor Braithwaite should be able to. She has the agenda. So these are the motions that are in the agenda package. So there's no need to read them out. So you want to move the second item?
Where am I? Here, just a minute. Sorry.
I'll let.
Oh,
This is
and you would like me to read it out, correct?
it's probably a good call, just so that we're all
Yeah.
clear about where we are in the agenda package.
I actually, Mayor, I do have them in front of me, so they don't need to be read out.
Okay. So the second one, which is to direct staff to provide a no objection and opt-out response for the permanent change at the Royal Victoria Yacht Club. That's the second one, so we're all clear about that's moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? I don't see any. All right. All those in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed. The third one, just very similar, provide no comments response for the temporary expansion. Is there a mover and seconder for that? Moved and seconded. Thank you. Any discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. And then the last one, do you want to make that, Councillor Green? This is the direct staff to draft a liquor license referral policy regarding opting out of the process.
Yes, I will do that. So moved.
Moved and seconded. Thank you. Is there discussion on this? I am just going to speak on this, not seeing other hands. I'm not going to support the motion. I personally think that we don't have a lot of permanent liquor licenses, almost none. We've had in my time on council, I think one, maybe two in 10 years. It seems to me that in such a small community where people have a liquor license ask, it's typically a substantive change in the makeup of the community, and I don't think we should just be referring these off. It's not like we're at a large center where these are sort of constantly rotating. You know, we're talking here about permanent changes to liquor license pieces that might be a pub expansion or a restaurant opening or wanting to do something quite different. And I just think that there's most of the time, even in those situations, it's pretty straightforward, but there may be some chances here where we local knowledge is important, and as much as I appreciate that the province does a public engagement process, they don't have any local knowledge, and they basically, if they don't hear anything specific, they essentially approve them. So I'm not supportive of the motion that's in front of us. I would be supportive of us asking us to develop fees structures so that we could recover some of these costs when the permanent ones come in. But I'm not going to support the motion that's on the floor right now.
Mayor?
Yeah, go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you. Sorry, I was trying to get in. I was going to be saying something very similar in that I would not be supportive of this, basically around the same reasons that you have put forward.
Okay, thank you. I know it's very late where you are, so I know you're trying to be quiet, but it's just if you could speak a little closer to the microphone. We could hear you, but it was very close to being almost inaudible. Go ahead, Councillor Smart.
Yeah, I can understand at this time wanting to keep informed. That seems really valuable. As someone who at their day job does often do these liquor licensing applications, I would anticipate that the sidewalk patios would actually all come in as liquor license applications, because you do need to do the occupancy count and the washroom check and all those things. So we may just want to wait till we reach the point in which we do feel that we want to potentially look at delegating to staff as opposed to coming to council. But yeah, I have no strong feelings at this point if we want to stay with what has been working for the district.
Councillor Patterson. Councillor Green, did you wish to speak as well?
That's okay.
Thank you, Mayor. I also will not be supporting this last section. For many of the reasons that are stated, there are very few of these that come forward, but I would like to perhaps revisit this a little bit later once patio cafes come back and we have more certainty around that and can discuss this more fully. Thank you.
Is there any other discussion? All right, I'm going to call the question. The motion is on the floor. This is to develop a policy opting out of the process. All those, sorry, I saw a hand pop up on the screen. All those in favor? And those opposed? Councillor Watson, Murdoch, Smart, Patterson.
Braithwaite.
And Braithwaite opposed. That motion fails. So no opting out piece of that. Can I just ask the question, though? I think there's probably worthwhile looking at adding some fees to recover some of those costs. Is that something that requires a motion from us? I mean, that seems very granular in terms of less of governance and more about the pieces. Perhaps is that something that, as updates are done to the fees and charges bylaw, that could be considered as one of the changes, or would you like to see a motion on that? I'm not sure if it's a good idea or not. I just think it's worth certainly looking at and bringing back, but I don't know if that's, I hate motions that delve that far into a bylaw without looking at the bylaw. Go ahead, Mr. Bull.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. The land use procedure bylaw is an ongoing project from the last term anyway that we need to wrap up. And this would be, I think, Mr. Green and I would add this to a list of things that we already have in mind for that update, where we also need to look at current fees for existing applications, but also a couple of other, call them blind spots in our procedures that we want to cover off. So I think in that context, we can follow up on that at the staff level, I think. Thank you.
That's fine with me. I think that's worth considering. Okay. Is there any other discussion on the matter under 7.1? I don't see any, so move on to 7.2. We have council meeting times, always a fun one to talk about. I'm going to probably give this to Mr. Coates, who provided the report to provide an introduction. For those at home watching, Mr. Coates is our Director of Corporate Services. Welcome, Mr. Coates.
Thank you, Your Worship and members of council. So before you is a report that results from your January 9th, 2023 meeting, where two motions were passed on this topic. One was to provide you with options for potential amendments to the council procedure bylaw, which is the governing document to your meeting processes locally. And that is by options in terms of in-camera meetings as a separate standalone time and or not in association with a scheduled regular meeting or taking place after a regular meeting. And also then, council gave consideration to the issue of the start time for your open meetings and asked staff to provide you some analysis on that. So we've done that in this report, and not to sort of dive into that in great detail, but happy to answer any questions council has. We did start off with a section on public participation, as that was an issue that was raised in terms of generally an objective towards looking at the times at which council meets. So just provided you with some commentary on that notion and how difficult it is to truly quantify whether or not the time or day or that sort of thing around when you meet, how that would influence public participation. There really isn't any way to quantify that, so we're not doing that. We just raised a number of issues that generally speaking result in increase or I guess decrease public participation. So likewise, we provided you with some commentary on the start times for council meetings, and that is very much within council's complete discretion to think about and put your minds to. The one thing about that is certainly the later a meeting starts, the later a meeting ends, and we've flagged a few issues in the report around potential implications on that. And the notion of in-camera meetings, the day and the time for those, and generally speaking, it's carte blanche. People, local governments choose to do them separately or choose to do them in conjunction with a regular meeting. Council's got complete discretion in that regard. And again, just flagging some issues around whether or not there are barriers in any of these issues, not so much on the in-camera, that's more council availability, but the meetings tend to sort of coexist, and so therefore one choice will affect another potentially in terms of when meetings are held. You did ask us for providing you with some options, so we've done that in a very broad-based way. One of them obviously just maintaining the status quo, which is the current meeting structure of a 5:15 in-camera meeting followed by 6 p.m. Regular open council meetings. The second option was holding daytime council meetings before the open meeting, and just to be clear on that, in that option, before means any time before, whether it's that day or a day before that day. Council has complete discretion based on your schedules on when you might choose to do that. And lastly, a third option, which was a bit sort of more maverick in its approach, was thinking about another day of the week, and that was coming forward with the notion of Thursdays. And really the reason behind that was to create more weekday space for council to review agendas and for staff to respond to any inquiries that council might have in relation to the matters that are raised on your agendas. And so very much these are broad options that you can sort of pick and choose from in between, and we haven't been very focused in on specific dates and times, but rather just flagging the issue for a more general conversation. And happy to answer any questions or have a deeper dive at whatever level you would like.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coates. As this is sort of a discretion of council kind of discussion, I just am going to ask any members of the public who wish to address us, please call and address us now, because I think we're going to get into discussion about the meat and the merits of the various times and spaces pretty quickly. So with that, I'm just going to make the call right now. Anybody from the public who wishes to address council, this is the chance to do so. I do have one question I prepared just to make sure I had enough time to draw us through the public participation adding, but I'll go to other questions first if people have any questions of staff at this time. Yeah, go ahead, Councillor Smart.
Through you, Mayor, am I correct, Mr. Coates, in understanding that with the option 2, that in-camera meetings could essentially still be in tandem and potentially held at typically at 6:15 before a 7 o'clock meeting as one of the options for option 2?
Go ahead, Mr. Coates.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to the question from Councillor Smart. So yes, and certainly the title of option 2, which is daytime meetings, tends to suggest otherwise, but that's clearly an option council has to create that structure in whatever way you choose for it to work. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. My question on this was sort of tangential to the core the piece, which I think is pretty much down to what works for us and we think works for the public. But there is, we do an annual survey of things for things, and I'm just wondering, you know, we've talked about getting public, you know, feedback on this and how hard that is in the report. Is that, can we solicit feedback through some sort of, like, through that process on more than just budget, but looking at things like this about what, or if there's strong community feeling about start times, or meeting times, I should say, really, probably more importantly.
Oh, Your Worship, yes, that's certainly an option.
Okay. Thank you. So back to this table, I don't see any members of the public who have scrabbled around to things. I think procedurally here, it might be worthwhile just, we've thought about this a lot. We have 2 new councillors that have now lived with our current model a bit of time and have a sense of the strengths and weaknesses of it. I think important to recognize the, in talking with staff, I just wanted to get some clarification about what times would work. And I think it's in the report, but just to be clear, I mean, there's a conversation we could have about what day of the week. I'm not sure there's a strong impetus. I didn't hear last time that there was a desire to change the day of the week, but if that's something that people wish to see, that is an option. Then it's really down to the time that we start the in-camera, the regularly scheduled in-camera, and the time that we start the regularly scheduled council and committee of the whole meetings. And for clarity, the question was asked about the what time that those shift. They can both shift wherever we want them, practically speaking. If we want to have a regularly scheduled in-camera that provides information related to the council meeting, it probably has to either be in the day sometime of the council meeting. If the council meeting's on Monday, it would be Monday or Friday would be the 2 practical days that we could hold a regularly scheduled in-camera. So it's something to think about, you know, if that's where that fits. So, and they're tied together, right? I mean, obviously the start time and the day and so forth of the public meeting is tied quite closely to what works best from in-camera. So, I mean, I think we all have, before we get to motions and other pieces on this, if there's any, I think maybe if people have thought about it, I might just go around the table and just, if there may be consensus at this table about what people are interested in doing, there might not be, but I'd be curious to hear if people have, if you've landed on something already of a preference, I would like to hear it. And we can maybe formulate some direction from that. Councillor Patterson, do you want to start us off?
I'm not certain, Mayor, that I am the best person to do this, but I will. I don't really understand why we changed to this time, so what precipitated that. However, this is the situation we find ourselves in now. I think one thing that is important to me is that most of us, I think, will have schedules that have already been established for regional and community meetings, and so I definitely would not like to see a change in the day at this point in time. I think that would not be of benefit and could cause a lot of difficulty for members of council. So, but right now, it just seems we've spent a great deal of time on trying to figure out when to have a meeting. And we are set right now, so I would, I think, stay with option 1, maintaining the status quo meeting times as were adopted in 2022, and direct staff to seek community input no later than 2026, with criteria that would focus on removing barriers to potential candidacy for public office and or community engagement.
Councillor Smart?
Yeah, personally, coming into this schedule, it has worked very well for me, but I am very, very appreciative of this motion coming to the table and giving any opportunities to have greater public input and availability to the public. So I would be in favor of option 2 with the caveat of pairing it with the in-camera meetings. I personally do not have a private space at work in which to have in-camera meetings during the day, and it while I could maybe arrange in the long term to rent some private office space, I would really need some predictability around that and some time to prepare to change my schedule. And I'm not in favor of changing the day because I don't feel like that would meet the goal of increasing public participation on Thursday, which I feel is a busier day for many.
Councillor Braithwaite, you're virtual, but you're normally sitting in that seated position. Where's your general feeling on this?
Thanks, Mayor. I'm actually in agreement with Councillor Patterson to go with option 1 and maintain the status quo and then look for some public input.
I'll just go in order. There's no difference for my opinion than anybody else's on this one. My general feeling on this one is I'm quite comfortable with the 6 o'clock start on Mondays. I don't think changing the day is the right thing to do. I find 6 o'clock is a reasonable balance of having enough time post-work to recover and get here, and still allow staff, if we have a late night, to still get up in the morning and get to work, and the rest of us as well. That being said, I don't like the current 5:15. I don't find it works well. I find it's a rush to get through that meeting if there's anything of any substance on it, and it doesn't give us time to ask questions and go away and have those answered prior to the meeting time. So I would love to find some time that worked, whether that's during the day on the Monday, which sounds like it's not going to work for everybody, and I wouldn't want to change if it doesn't work for everybody. But perhaps on a Friday, either sort of morning or noon time or something on Fridays, if people have Fridays off or have those options, we're happy with that. I do find that the current 5:15 in camera 6 o'clock council meeting quite difficult. And I can certainly see coming from work what a stress that is to the whole piece. And I think it's nice for people to be able to go and have a meal with family and stuff before they come to the meeting. So I guess I'm torn on this one. My preference would be to keep the 6 o'clock main start, but change the in-camera to some other time, maybe on a Friday. That allows us the chance to have a conversation and come in on 6. If we're not going to do that, if we're going to tie them back to back, I'd probably be more inclined to move the times back to maybe to 6 and 7, so that we have. But again, I struggle with this because oftentimes we have a 10-minute in camera and then we have time waiting, and then sometimes we have an hour and 20 minutes and we can't finish the business at hand. So I kind of like the idea of separating the schedule out on those ones, but that's kind of where I'm sitting at right now. Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Well, thank you, Your Worship. I guess I'm well documented on this one, having this coming up from my original motion to move the start times back, or the times back to their original location. I continue to be an advocate for regular meeting start times at 7 o'clock. I'm adamant and still convinced that a 7 o'clock start time for members of the public provides for greater accessibility. I do appreciate the comments in the staff report about increasing online options, increasing online access, and I agree with all of that. Nevertheless, I'm still committed to having the greatest degree of accessibility to people in chambers and at a time that works for them. I'm not in favor of changing the day of the week. I am not in favor of the current 5:15 start time for the in-camera meetings, because I do think that it's difficult in terms of getting all the business done. So my preference at this stage of the game, and as was going to be my suggestion tonight, would be if council is focused on the idea of retaining if the general will of council is to retain the in-camera meeting immediately before the council meeting, I would advocate for a 6 o'clock start time for in-camera meetings, followed by a 7 o'clock start time for the regular council meeting. And that, in my opinion, provides a little bit of extra time for the in-camera portion of the meeting, and it also provides an exigency for council with a 7 o'clock start time in order to conduct the business of council in an expedient manner. I think that we should collectively set ourselves the goal for completing the work of council within the 3 hours allotted to us in the procedures bylaw, which would result in the majority of council meetings completing by 10 o'clock, which is not extremely late and not extremely early, but it is not extraordinarily late, and I think within the bounds of reasonableness considering regional standards. So again, Your Worship, I originally was very keen on, and my original proposal was to have 7 o'clock returned as the original start time. That was not supported by council, but seeing as how you asked the question, that's my preference as far as times, and I think potentially the better option would be 6 o'clock start time for in-camera and 7 o'clock for regular council meetings on Mondays. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thanks, Councilor Braithwaite, or Councilor Braithwaite, Councilor Appleton. Names. Go ahead, Councilor Watson.
Thank you, Mayor. I just first want to thank the staff for doing such a fulsome report. It was a really good piece of analysis, and you know, it laid the groundwork for us to have this discussion. So it's not taken lightly how much time was put into this. I just need to speak from my own situation, I guess. Having heard what others have said, the schedule that we've had so far has worked well for me, although I certainly, and I agree that I don't think we should switch the meeting date, so that seems to be fine. I am okay with later starts on Monday, but it's important for me to see the in-camera meeting and the council meeting tied together in some way, proximate to each other. If we move them apart, I certainly hear why that might be better in terms of allowing for time and more opportunity, but I know that from my own particular schedule, it would mean that I'd have to miss some of them, because I really have counted on, in terms of my work schedule and even access to private space to hold the meeting, it really, for me, it works better if it's here. So if we switched, that would be fine if that's the will of the group, but I would kind of just be providing advance notice that I would not be attending all the in-camera meetings. It just wouldn't be possible. But I am open to 5:15 start. I'm open to a 6 o'clock start. I'm open to a 7 o'clock start. And I would observe that it's really hard to know how long, if we have an in-camera meeting, whether it's going to take us 10 minutes or it's going to take us an hour. So to allow an hour and then just enjoy the time when we're not discussing the item is fine with me too. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilor Watson. Go ahead, Councilor Green.
Thank you very much. So I really appreciate all of the comments I've heard around the table, but I do support Councillor Appleton's proposal. And I also am conscious of the fact that the one gap here, and thank you very much for this report, it was excellent, but the gap is we don't have solid community feedback on meeting times, and not even on the new model that was introduced in 2022. I guess if I was going to look at this, I would be happy with status quo and by the end of the year, but during that time have a community input, a survey, whatever is required, because we are not, for whatever the reasons, we're not getting the kind of community participation we had pre-COVID. I mean, we just aren't. These chambers used to be quite full at times, and we had lots of participation. So I'm missing that, but I also feel there's a gap in this. I can't fully assess the success or not of the current model because I just don't have any solid feedback from the community on it. But I do like the proposal that Councillor Appleton has made, which is the 6 o'clock start for in-camera and the 7 o'clock start for meetings. I noticed in the analyses of a number of communities, most of them, the majority, seem to start meetings at 7 o'clock. It is a very old model. I think it's been around for decades as well. So it's always good to revisit something. But I think that one would work well. And I agree about the in-camera. It's too much of a squeeze. And sometimes I think it's important to make room and space for those discussions. So those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to consolidate what I've heard to try and get us to a point of having a conversation on a couple of options. One, unlikely that the separate time for in-camera is going to work, so that's interesting. So keep them together, and then there's really just two options. One, I guess three options: 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock start, 5:15, 6 o'clock start, which is the status quo. And I guess the other thing that comes to my mind, just talking about that, the extra bit of time is 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock model doable even for people? And I don't know if the answer to that is. But those seem to be the three sort of pieces, no Thursdays being contemplated by anybody around the table. They've all got their pros and cons, and I do appreciate this is often down to people's individual schedules. And in fairness, I'm in this role I have right now, I'm probably the most flexible. I don't like the 5:15 start because I find it's just so cramped. I don't like having to eat food on the way in here, those sorts of things. But it's hardly a hardship for me either. So I'm not going to balk at it if there's no convenient way for people to do it off-site, off time. So can I just ask one question of the two members who expressed they can't do other times? Is there any, because Fridays are different than Mondays, is there any difference in that feedback on a Friday versus a Monday in terms of availability of private space or time?
I have
The same problem?
I have more ability on Friday. I have more flexibility with my work schedule on Friday, personally.
I would have availability on Friday afternoons, but not in the morning.
Okay, I think that probably wipes it out because I think Friday afternoons are just too much to ask of people to try and have regularly scheduled meetings, yeah. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
I have already committed Friday afternoons to another meeting, so that would make availability more difficult for me.
That's perfect. I just wanted to just make sure that I was trying to eliminate as many options as I possibly can here. So I think we're back down to those original three I threw out there. 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 5:15, 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. Those seem to be the pieces. Go ahead, Councillor Appleton. Yeah.
A question for staff through you, Your Worship. Just in Mr. Coates' analysis, I noted that in the vast majority of situations where the in-camera is held in conjunction with the regular meeting, the in-camera is held after the regular meeting. And I completely understand the mechanism and the usefulness of having it beforehand in order to receive advice that might then be used in part of the regular meeting. I'm just wondering whether Mr. Coates could comment on any of the comments that he potentially received while reaching out to, our colleagues. Is that just an artifact, or is that based on anything specific?
Mr. Coates?
Thank you, Your Worship, through you to Councillor Appleton and to council members on the general question. So I think, not sure I'd use the term artifact, but I think it's a very long-standing practice to do them after. Now, there's some advantages around that approach, of course, which is that the public decision-making piece takes place earlier in the evening. And so if council were to think about barriers to public participation, the time, and I referenced that in the report to some degree, is that the time that occurs, depending on one's individual circumstances, could be construed as a barrier depending on those circumstances. So thinking later in the evening could be a deterrent to the public to sort of stick it out that long. The notion of that approach is also one that there's nothing in the procedure bylaws or in the rules of proceedings to close a meeting in midstream or at the beginning of it. So for example, if there was a piece of advice that council needed to receive on a matter that you were going to consider that night, you can resolve to close the meeting, because we've kind of get our minds, I think, set in the notion that there's two distinct meetings. But in reality, one meeting, you can close a portion of a meeting to have a discussion. So if there was a time-sensitive matter that was coming up in the agenda, you could start your meeting if you wanted to and close it for that portion so the public's temporarily excluded. And then you have that piece of advice provided to you. It's typically legal advice. And then you reconvene the open meeting, carry on with the conversation. And if at council's discretion, if your regularly scheduled closed meeting, for example, is at the end of that, you've really tidied it all up into one meeting. You have one meeting for council, and portions of that are open and portions of that are closed. So there is a practical element to that approach.
Thank you. And in fact, it's sort of where we're at now, in a sense that we start the open portion of the meeting, we go in camera, we come out of in camera and go back. I do note that that's more common, that resolving in camera and coming out again in jurisdictions that have a staff lawyer. It's seen at the CRD in the City of Victoria. I see it quite often, but very rarely at places where we have to schedule an external lawyer to come and give us advice, because we can't do so the questions arising typically. Mr. Coates, I don't know if this...
Thank you, Your Worship. Because oftentimes too, staff are conveying the legal advice on behalf of the legal counsel, and it's not necessarily the case in all circumstances that the legal counsel is present, but you're giving consideration to advice that's come from the lawyer and is therefore discretionarily excluded from public consumption at that point.
Very good, thank you. I saw a hand over here, Councillor Green.
So I mentioned this before, I think, during our last discussion. We have a spare Monday every month. We have the first Monday of every month that is not a meeting day. Is it possible to organize in-camera meetings on that Monday once a month, or is that not possible? Correct me, I might not have a good understanding of it. Does in-camera have to be attached to a meeting, and a regular meeting? So that requirement for the 4 Mondays a month was dropped in 2011. I think has had an impact on agendas and workload, but I could be wrong, so that's just a question. Thanks.
Coates?
Thank you, Your Worship. On the question, council has complete discretion about when you meet, and there's nothing, and I know Ms. Williams might like to add something into this from her perspective as the CAO, but from a structural sense, council's free to meet as frequently or as infrequently as the case may be. I mean, and I note that in the report that there's no limitations or there's no minimum requirements. So it really comes down to, is there, from meeting management points of view, from availability of people's point of view, you have the complete discretion.
Yes, just a question arising through you to Mr. Coates. Thank you, Mr. Coates. On average, and I didn't actually read all of the detailed, some of the narratives with the analyses, but on average, is it your understanding that most municipalities meet 4 Mondays or 4 days a month as opposed to 3? Thank you.
Mr. Coates?
Thank you, Your Worship. I wouldn't say that I'd be in a position with the depth of dive on that analysis to say one way or the other. And I think it really becomes a question of the scale of issues that are being considered by that particular council. And so, there's a number of contributing factors to that. Things like what if anything is or isn't delegated to staff to approve. So that affects the agendas. What is sort of conventional practice in the municipality? So there's a bit of comparing apples to oranges in that kind of analysis, because having worked in 7 different municipalities, the sort of the flavor of what council's agendas look like is dramatically different in every place that I've worked, for sure.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Councillor Green? I've already asked for the public input, have not had any. We've had a general comments section here. Procedurally, I think we can probably just get to the status quo is the default. So if there's any motions that people want to raise to change it, we'd need a majority of council to change the start times. I think we're down to 3 options. Really, one of them is status quo, and the other 2 are other options that people can make. So I'll probably turn to members of the council if they wish to make motions to change. Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. I will test the will of council. So I would propose that the council procedures bylaw be amended in order to start regularly scheduled in-camera meetings at 6 p.m. with regular meetings beginning at 7, following at 7 p.m.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Thank you. You're free to motivate. I know you've had a chance to speak to it already, but if you wish to add anything, other comments?
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll be brief. I would say that this represents a bit of a compromise solution. I think it allows a bit more time in the in-camera portion, and I'm conscious of the comments by Mr. Coates of when public participation occurs. So I think that is of significance. I think, given historical practice in Oak Bay and given the public expectation, this provides, into my mind, the greatest degree of certainty. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to just turn to staff very quickly just to get a sense of procedurally here. A, is the motion worded appropriately to make those changes, because it's a direction to change? Is there a notification and time period, this would have to go through a change of the procedures bylaw, as I understand it, and then and a readoption of a new standard schedule of meetings. Is that how that would work, Mr. Coates?
Oh, Your Worship, that's correct. Yes. So council has an obligation before considering adoptions of changes to the council procedure bylaw that the public has an opportunity to comment on those specific changes. So typically that happens either after second or third reading. It depends how long council wants to sort of let that sit out there. But technically speaking, it would be after second and before adoption. And so at third reading, of course, then if council were to make changes based on the public feedback, and I apologize if I'm getting too granular in my comments, but there's a bit of a question of style in that one. And so that's right. So, and I did take some liberties with Councillor Appleton's words up there to direct staff to bring forward amendments to the bylaw that would suit if that's to council's level of acceptance.
Liberty's welcome. I think as long as it captured maybe that. Sorry, Councillor Tecose, do you want to add something else?
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. And Ms. Williams just pointed out too. So just in terms of that, I'm drawing the assumption that the committee of the whole meetings, which happen once a month, would follow suit, that they would start at 7 o'clock as opposed to 6. And so we could say that to provide for council in-camera meetings at 6 and open meetings at 7. And the open meeting reference includes committee of the whole meetings.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's how I read that as well. So the motion's on the floor. Discussion. We've had people giving their initial feedback on where they sit, but we've had a discussion on this, and we have a motion in front of us. So go ahead, Councillor Green.
On a lighter note,
Kevin,
if we adopted these 6 and 7, we'd save some money on dinners and menus and so on.
Councillor Watson and then Braithwaite.
Yes, just with respect to the motion, it is missing the word Monday, and I think that's part of our deliberation. So I would like to suggest that we actually have that in the motion. It's not clear to me, if I was seeing that from the outside, that's what we're talking about. Are we talking about Mondays? Okay.
My read of this is because Mondays are currently it, unless it specifically changes the date, it would remain Monday. So I don't think it's required as part of the motion. Yeah. Yep, that's great. Thank you. Always better to ask the question, because otherwise we can come back the next week and go, by the way, we didn't quite get the wording right on this one. Councillor Braithwaite, please.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Although I'm in agreement with
You just speak up, just speak slightly closer to your microphone, ever so slightly, Councillor Braithwaite.
Okay, is that better?
That's a little better.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'll make it very brief. Although those times would actually work for me, what I am considering in my head is I'm considering staff and how this would affect staff to have the meetings go later. So sadly, for that reason, and because I would like to see some public input, I'm going to vote against this motion on the floor.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Mayor. And when we got into the initial conversation in this, I supported staying then with the status quo at the 7 o'clock meetings with in-camera prior to it. But I don't support the motion now simply because we will again be changing the procedural bylaw, which means going through the public hearing process. We went through that to in fact change the meetings to the 6 p.m. start. We haven't had feedback from the public yet on what they think about this. Now we will be going to public hearing again without having sought any input from the community in advance. And I really think to do the reach out first would be a better move forward on council's decision. And since we all did run for election understanding what the times were for this, hopefully we could get through it for a few months more until we do in fact do the reach out to the community and engage what the input is. We could change the meetings to 7 o'clock and still find that that people are not coming back to the hall, that they are, in fact, many people tell me they watch this. They don't always phone in, but they do watch the meetings. And I just have no understanding at this point. So I feel like I'm making it a decision that is as ill-informed now as it was originally. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. It's an interesting argument wording. Councillor Smart, I'm going to ask for your input on this just because I think it's important that we hear from everybody at the table.
Yeah, I hear the desire for public input, and I think for me the irony of that is, like, unless this is wrapped up in sort of a bigger public input like the overall budget commentary, I don't think we're going to hear from the people who we're trying to attract to the meetings because they're too busy to write in. So I guess I feel quite confident in the fact that a large portion of the population has a busy dinner hour at 6, and also confident in the vast majority of other councils that have council meetings at 7. So I personally feel confident enough to go ahead and make this change and feel it as one for the better at this time.
I guess my comments last here as usual. You know, I'm torn on this one. I think I'm generally I already stated my preference. I prefer the 6 o'clock start, but I don't think the 5:15 time frame for in-camera is sufficient for time or for the right pieces. So I appreciate there's no other options because we seem, by the nature of who we have around the table right now and people's lives, that's the reality of the situation. So you know, I think, and I also am quite swayed by Councillor Patterson's argument that, you know, having this being driven by some public feedback, if we could do a survey to give us some indication if there's an overwhelming preference from the public, then we should be trying to accommodate that piece of it. Can I ask a question of staff? I asked it sort of at the beginning because I wasn't entirely clear. But I think I heard that we do that annual survey. Is that something that we can include, that question, into that what is currently a budget survey? Is that something we could add into that process that has a bit of a broader public interest? Ms. Williams.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, we've actually recently rebranded the budget questionnaire survey to the annual residence survey for the purpose of including questions of this nature. So we're moving out of just service level questions into more questions such as, when do you want to hear from us? How do you want to hear from us? So yes, this could be included.
So I guess procedurally here, we've had this report. We have a decision point tonight to make. If we move forward with the changes now, that goes in. We probably wouldn't survey on this at that point because we've essentially made the changes for the balance of the year. So if we're going to include, okay, I'm thinking out loud here, not really asking a question. Yeah, I'm struggling with this one. I think optically it would look better for us to ask the question of the public before we make a permanent change. At the same time, I do think it's inherently better for us as decision makers to be doing the 6 and 7 o'clock time than the 5:15. I think it just gives us a bit more time available. All right, that's all I have to say on that matter. Probably didn't help anybody at all in their decision making. Mr. Coates.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I just want to maybe expound on a comment that was made earlier as well, which is into one of your questions. There is a mandatory consultation, if you like, for making changes to the council procedure bylaw, and there's sort of minimum notice requirements for that. So thinking about it, there's a couple of different ways that this could be structured, and certainly as part of your consideration on the proposed amendments, we could also include in that report a couple of options for sort of a bit of a one-off public comment opportunity on this procedure bylaw. Like, for example, council could create an opportunity for public comment on the proposed changes that was sort of more than just putting notice in the newspaper that there's pending changes under consideration. So there's a bit of a canvas there that's a bit blank in terms of being able to prescribe something that's got more more public participation to the very specific changes being made, if that's what council wished to consider when those amendments come forward.
So I'm just, if I hear you correctly, what you're suggesting is that if this resolution passes, that would direct staff to bring forward those amendments to the bylaw, but at the same time, we could contemplate when that report comes back, is that the contemplation? The council could consider at that point doing a more sort of, hey community, we're looking at these we're contemplating these changes. We'd like to hear from you before we move forward, kind of reach out.
Your Worship, yes, and maybe I'm not making, I could be more clear in terms of what the minimum requirements are. So we have to give a notice in the newspaper of the proposed changes. We have to describe what they are and tell people how they can provide council with their feedback on that. So the minimum requirements have a public input component to it, and there's no, that's prescribed in the legislation. So council would be free to expand that if council wished to do that. But there are those minimum requirements that are going to invite the public to provide comments should they have them.
Okay, thank you for that. I will just state on that basis, not on that basis, but with that thought, that helps clarify my mind on this one. I'm actually I'm comfortable supporting the motion as it stands here. Obviously withholding the right to keep an open mind on this as it goes through the process of first, second reading and public input. But I think that public input is important. I think if we turn our minds to how we do that effectively and ask the question, what works better for you? If there's a strong feedback one way or the other, that'll help guide my thoughts on whether or not to move this forward into the bylaw changes phases. But I think it's it's worthy for us to ask the question of the community, and this is the best mechanism I can think of to do that outside of the end of the year one. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to opinion as much as anything else. And so getting that public feedback, to my mind, is worthwhile. So that's where I'm sitting at right now. Go ahead, Councillor Green.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for us to add context to the outreach to the public. The context is that we're trying to motivate and incentivize people to attend and participate in our meetings. That's really the genesis for the changes. At least that was, I think, my genesis, and I'm sure that was Councillor Appleton's. Councillor Smart has said things similar. We want people to come and we want the public to participate. That's the bottom line, and we're trying to find the best time to accommodate that. So I think that's an important message that we should have in our material, that this isn't just a random change. It's about the community's needs and about motivating them to participate in our meetings. It's about encouraging them to come and be part of, the decision making in their community. So I think that's an important message that is the rationale for all of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Go ahead, Councillor Watson.
Thank you. There is a motion on the floor, which would propel us to gathering public input on something we're doing immediately. And then there's the other idea that we might hold off, keep what we're doing right now, and use a different vehicle to ask the public about their more general views about how they're involved and consulted. And I have to say that taking in Mr. Coates' analysis about public participation more generally, I think that the more narrow engagement we would get if we do a proposal for a bylaw amendment right now is not really going to get to that. There are many, many different things that we don't understand that drive whether or not people will actually physically attend in the room or online what's going on before council at the table. And so I'm not sure that this mechanism of posting notice in the newspaper and asking for comments about the very specifics of this meeting time are the right way to get at that. So for that reason, can't support the motion, and I would go for the status quo if it provides us an opportunity to have a more constructive engagement with the community around how they want to be involved in community life, because we know they do engage around all sorts of tools that we use. So just council meetings is too narrow in my view. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. I'm going to ask, you spurred a question in my mind. There is a community engagement or communications strategy as well coming forward. Could you just refresh us on what that is and when it's coming back to council?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes. So that's one of the number of project backgrounders that council considered in the council priorities sessions, and that one was moved forward. So it's a community engagement and communications strategy. So we will be moving forward with that in the near term. Now that's still it's a fairly involved process. We'll be seeking consultant services to do that and sort of develop how we communicate out, but also likely be consulting with the community on how best to communicate and get their feedback. So it is communications and engagement strategy is what it is. That's what council has approved. So that work will take place this year. I can't say with conviction that it'll be completed this year, but it'll get started this year, and I would anticipate it would be completed either late this year or early next year.
Thank you for that. Councillor Appleton, did you see your hand raised? No. Councillor Patterson?
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I am cautious on this because last term we spent a great deal of time on council procedural bylaw, and I think that caused a lot of disengagement for people who really weren't that interested in attending the meetings to hear about the procedural bylaw. But since we did move forward with the change of times, and I certainly respect from my colleagues around the table here that there are some people whose schedules are less flexible perhaps than mine, and it's important that we attempt to accommodate those schedules so that we can all participate fully in the meetings. But have we received, since we've changed the time, have we received complaints or comments from the public in general about the change in times and inconvenience or a barrier to participation or any displeasure at the change in the meeting times?
Mr. Coates?
Your Worship, to the question, so I believe those changes were made in March of 2022. I joined the staff here in May of 2022, so I can speak to that time. Ms. Williams indicated to me that there hadn't been anything prior to my arrival here, so I'm not aware of any documented concerns that we have received from members of the public around their ability or inability to participate based on the times that council meets.
Correct, we changed, the start times changed in March of 2022? That doesn't sound right.
Your Worship, it's in the report, and I believe the bylaw was adopted in March.
February of, right in March, okay.
Yeah.
It's recent, okay. Okay, I have Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. And to that exact point, I will make reference in the, and I understand why the language is used this way in the report, so it's not a criticism, but right now it refers to the status quo being what we're doing right now, which by definition is the status quo. But I would make 2 points here. The status quo, in fact, what is being presented here in the motion, which is currently on the floor, moving regular council meetings back to 7 o'clock, that in fact was the status quo for many years, in fact decades, and the change to 6 o'clock is relatively recent. And I would note the conversation, well, I understand the nature of the conversation here. I would note that the concern seems to be around whether or not we will affect a change in engagement by moving to a 6 and 7 o'clock start time. This same conversation did not occur when we moved from the original status quo to what we have been doing for the past year. I do not recall council entertaining a large-scale public consultation The same conversation was had about minimum requirements for public engagement to have people afforded the opportunity to engage with that process. But in terms of a larger scale public engagement, to talk about whether or not people would prefer a new start time, that was not contemplated at that time. So I am a bit, I consider the original meeting times that were in place for a long time, I consider that to be the status quo. And we did not, in my recollection, consult with the public extensively about moving it from this historical status quo. So I actually don't see this as being a time, or there seems to be a lot of sensitivity about whether or not this will affect the public as far as the change in time from its current status. We're proposing reverting to the original status, and I would not want to see us delay a potential improvement in process based on a consultation, which again we didn't have that consultation the first time around. So, in any case, that's my view on it, Your Worship. I view this more as reverting to a status quo, and in as much as I would never disincentivize a public consultation process, I concur with Councillor Smart. I think most of the people that could be disincentivized from this process or would prefer the status quo, the traditional historical start time, do not have the time or necessarily or the inclination to engage in a discussion of this nature. They're just not here because they're just not here. They're just busy. So that's my view on it, Your Worship. So I would just ask, I guess I would reflect on that concept that we're talking a lot about the necessity to provide a large-scale consultation mechanism to move back to where we originally were, which we didn't follow, to my mind, when we moved it to the current time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Upland. I'm going to try and wrap this up because all this conversation about late meeting times, we're spending a lot of time on this and making it late meeting time. I think we've talked most of the points, but I'm happy to go. If anybody has any additional last points before we go to calling the question on this motion, go ahead, Councillor Green.
I'll be very brief. I have had feedback from younger members of our community, younger families. 6 o'clock, for those of us that have had children and small children, is probably the worst possible time to leave home and try and make a meeting. Absolutely. So all I'm saying is, yes, there's been feedback, not necessarily complaints, but just saying, wow, it's just impossible for me to get there. So I guess that's the feedback that I've personally had. And I agree with Councillor Appleton. I think the three of us, it was Councillor Patterson, myself, and Councillor Appleton last year, did not support the change. And he reminds me that we did not have the discussion either that we're having tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Good conversation, I have to say. My mind has gone back and forth on this about 3 or 4 times as I've listened to people talk. So I think one of these situations where there's not a clear right answer, it's really a matter of, is this the right time to make this change? Is this the right change to make? We making it without full input from public or others, but that does not mean it's not totally a reasonable thing to be doing at this point. So, are there any other comments before I call the question? The motion, go ahead, Councillor Smart.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly say that it definitely did come up on going door to door on the election campaign for me with families that, yeah, how could I ever get to a council meeting at 6 o'clock? So it's not that it's never talked about.
And Mayor?
Yeah, go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you. And I also heard the opposite of that as well when I was going door to door, and I've had other people comment to me that they like the start time of 6 o'clock. I think that without actual letters that have come in, I think that all of that is just really anecdotal. I can't even speak, sorry, anecdotal. So I think that we need to take that into consideration. We've all heard different things, but really it should be any letters or something of that matter that come into council that we should take into consideration.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. I can speak for myself as someone who likes to go to bed at 9 o'clock. I have more negatives from being up late than I do from being here early, but that's just me. So The motion is on the floor, and I'm ready to call the question, I think, unless there's any other discussion that people wish to throw in there. All right, the motion right now is to, as listed there, you can't see it, Councillor Braithwaite, so I'm going to read it aloud for you so you know what's the exact wording that's in front of us. It says that council directs staff to bring forward amendments to the council procedure bylaw to provide for in-camera meetings at 6 p.m. and open meetings at 7 p.m. That's the motion on the floor right now. All right, call the question. All those in favor? And those opposed? Councillor Patterson, Councillor Braithwaite?
Braithwaite.
Braithwaite opposed. That's 2 opposed. I'm voting in favor of this. That carries. So that will, well, it will direct staff to come back with a piece. I do think it's worthwhile for us to have a little, and, you know, and I didn't speak again because I think it was necessary, but I think we have 2 chances of getting public interest. One is part of the annual survey. The other one is sort of on the 1-year anniversary. And I think we can treat this as we're just past the 1-year anniversary. We can go out there and ask people's opinion about whether or not they think it's working or not, and their feedback on it. I think we can get some reasonable feedback to inform us in the decision making. So that carries. Is there any other items arising just beyond the core part of that? No? Okay, moving on. Is there any new business? Is there any adjournment? Motion to adjourn, moved and seconded. Motion to adjourn is on the table. Any other discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed. That carries. Councillor Braithwaite, we have to go back into the in-camera briefly, just to remind you. So I think you can come into the into that separate meeting. We'll just take a moment here to log out of this. Thank you, everybody.